Welcome to my presentation today. I'm Moritz Henke. I'm an ETF product manager at VanEck Europe, and in that role I develop new ETFs, but I also manage our existing products like our space ETF. And we'll be talking here today about where the space industry is today, where it's headed in the future, and how you actually can invest into space. Exactly. So, very short introduction to VanEck. We're a global asset manager headquartered in New York. We're family-owned by our CEO, Jan van Eck. And in Europe, we're most known for our thematic ETFs, for example, gaming, semiconductor, defense, but also now space. You can actually see that, for example, defense now in the Q1, in the first quarter of 2025, has been one of the most attractive themes that we had almost 2 billion inflows. But when you actually look at the relative inflows in terms of AUM, the orange dot that you see there, our space ETF has almost doubled in size. 50% of the current AUM is inflows from Q1. So there's a lot happening in space right now, and that's why I'm here to talk to you about today. Just generally, you see that our strategy here in Europe has paid off also in the last years. We increased our AUM from 4 billion in 2020 to more than 17 billion as of today. And we're very happy to be here in Europe and disrupt the ETF sphere with our passive thematic ETFs, but also other products just like dividend ETFs. So let's look at space. And for that, I actually brought you some headlines because, as mentioned, there's really a lot happening right now. And this first slide is on the Financial Times. And you probably all know the Financial Times, a very well-known newspaper, what headlines about space they had in the first quarter in 2025. This one, the race to claim the moon's airwaves, it's about that companies want to build radio stations or radio frequencies on the moon. The next one is that India also plans their moon, Mars, and crewed missions and is looking to private companies to collaborate with. That's from February, for example. Mobile operators look to satellite technology. That is really interesting because, you know, in Europe, but also in the US, we still have some regions where you don't have good network with your phone or with the internet. And T-Mobile in the US, for example, is now working with Starlink to also bring internet and network via satellites to these rural areas where you don't have internet or network. And in Europe, Vodafone is doing that as well. This one, rockets, drones, and flying taxis. Brace for Wild West in the skies, also from February, is showing that the space, the low Earth orbit, is getting more and more crowded, and the normal passenger aeroplanes, they have less space because of all the rocket launches, the satellites that are launched into space, the drones that are there. So this is a challenge for these companies. And then the last one from March is about the power that Starlink has in the war in the Ukraine, and that some European companies could replace Starlink because there were some US threats that Starlink maybe doesn't provide data anymore in the Ukraine. Yeah, and then I actually had to update this presentation in the last week because even more happened in April. So Germany now wants to establish a complete new ministry for research and for space. Maybe you actually seen that news. Last week, Jeff Bezos sent Katy Perry to the low Earth orbit for a short 11-minute flight. It was just it's a PR gag, basically. Germany wants to have their own satellite system in space. The German army. NASA says we can go both to Moon and to the Mars, because there was always this debate in the US, can we finance both? So Trump's NASA pick says both can be done at the same time. And also Amazon is now currently, I think next week, they will send the first batch of, in total, 3,000 satellites to the low Earth orbit to rival Starlink. So as you can see, there's a lot happening right now. And where is it coming from? Why is this happening right now? And why do we see the space race right now? And we have identified basically 4 different factors that we will go through in this presentation step after step. The first one is technology. It's gotten way more cheaper to get into space because of the reusability of rockets. Then you have the second point, geopolitics. It's getting more tense between countries. US and China both have a lot. And that's the third point, financial support for the space industry and also individuals. I already mentioned Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. They put a lot of money, because space is very expensive, they put a lot of money currently into the space industry. And then the fourth point is just in general the industry. Of course, they are all benefiting from these first 3 factors, and there are a lot of new companies that some are private, some are public, some you can invest in, some you cannot invest in, but we'll go through this step by step in the next few minutes. So here, this is actually a very old prognosis from 2015, where researchers have said and already realized, okay, space is going to grow. It's going to grow from more than 250 billion to 460 billion, just the total market size. But comparing this prognosis from 2015 to where we stand now, we realize in this updated McKinsey study that we already have surpassed, we have beaten the estimates of the experts, and that space right now is bigger than experts thought it would be, and we still, also McKinsey prognoses a relatively high growth rate until 2035, that the whole sector is going to be 1.8 trillion US dollars. And this is basically from 2 factors on both sides. It's infrastructure, so the rocket launches, and then the satellites, the reach, what you do with the data. And this is both, again, through commercial, so companies, and government focus. This is also what McKinsey has found. Yeah? And here you can see the exact details, the exact numbers about how they prognose this, and they see especially the technological developments as a foundation. The reusability of rockets, as you can see, this has significantly decreased the cost of just 1 kilogram to send 1 kilogram of, for example, a satellite to space. A long time ago, it was very expensive. It cost more than 10,000 dollars per kilogram. Of course, you don't send 1 kilogram to space, you send tons and tons. I will show you later pictures of a satellite, how huge they actually are. And this is now lower than 500 US dollars due to the reusability of the rockets. You can use them multiple times. You don't have to collect the rubbish from different points in the earth, but you can actually start and then land again the rocket, and SpaceX has pioneered this, and there are now also other companies, public companies, that follow SpaceX example and exactly have these reusable rockets. And this has led to the fact, I've mentioned satellites already, that the number of active satellites in the orbit has increased substantially now in the last 5 years. It was lower than 1,500 satellites only in 2017, so 10 years ago, and now we have already reached 9,000, probably 10,000 in the next months, satellites in low Earth orbit, and that's of course a very substantial increase, almost exponential increase, as you can see here. And that, of course, brings opportunities for the industry to build rocket launches, to build satellite launches, to use these satellite data and to boost the space industry. Yeah, and then these are the exact details from the McKinsey study where they see the potential benefits. And as you can see, actually, they think this commercial aspect, that you use the data from the satellites, that you use this improved connectivity with internet, with TV, this actually generates most of new revenues in the space sector in the next 10 years. Of course, after that, still a lot of developments can happen, but in the near-term future, this is where the focus is. The realization through new satellites, starting from SpaceX, for example, it has more than 7,000 satellites in space. That's more than 2/3 of all satellites. Project Kuiper from Amazon, I already mentioned that they want to send up more than 3,000 satellites, but not in one go, and actually more than 48 goes starting next week. And then we have, for example, also European companies with satellites, Eutelsat and SES, but I will talk about these also later. And then on this other side, from this commercial aspect, already mentioned, the governments. They are, of course, due to the tensions that they currently have, there's a new space race happening, and they all want to be first, again, back to the moon, or first time to Mars. And they all have, the US and China, they are the two main countries and spending a lot of resources here. The US is not only NASA, but also a lot of private programs that go to moon and to Mars. As mentioned, NASA says we can do it both at the same time. China also has a clear plan. China has even built their own space station, the Tiangong space station, in 2022. And since then, they have manned it. So there are currently a lot of people, of Chinese people in that space station. And they also have their Chang'e Luna, so moon mission, and their Tianwen Mars missions. Yeah, so they are also very pushy, and they want to beat the US to bring back the first rock from the moon. So to travel to, from the Mars. So they want to travel to Mars and then come back with the same or next flight to bring back that rock. India is also pushing here. They also have their lunar missions. They're not as developed as US and China, but they're also focusing on improving their government focus here on these missions. They want to have a crewed mission, so want to also send people into the space and have their Mars and lunar missions. And in Europe, I already mentioned, the German ministry now has their own space part, and the German army also wants to improve the satellite reach. Yeah, so government funding is a very important part for space because it is very expensive. That is what you have to know. And the question is, okay, by now you probably have understood a lot is happening in space. The question now really is, how can we invest? Or how can I invest into space? And there are, of course, different opportunities. Government is difficult. You cannot directly invest into the NASA and get a return from it. You cannot directly invest into the US either through some bonds, but they're not really related to the space industry. So governments don't really work out. Then you have more diverse aerospace and defense companies. Yeah, so the big aerospace and defense companies, Boeing, Airbus, Lockheed Martin, Thales, they, of course, they operate, they have some space activity, but they have rather limited space activity. So usually only between 15 to 20% of their revenues come from the pure play space activity that we define. But they also have a lot of revenues from defense or from normal passenger jets, where we don't see now a big change happening. Why should passenger jets improve because of the space race? Yeah, so you have this option, but as I will explain later on, these, for example, are not included. These companies are not included in our ETF because we focus on the pure play companies. What is also not included are these public conglomerates. So these companies from Elon Musk, so Tesla or Amazon, because they don't. Of course, you connect them with space. Maybe Tesla sent their car to the low Earth orbit a couple of years back. Amazon also wants to send some satellites, but the portion of their revenues, the relevance for space for these companies is not very high, right? So they will also not be part of a strategy that is focused on space. And then you have the space companies. So the space companies, of course, they should be included, and there are different segments of space that can be focused on. So for example, we have here the rockets and launch systems. So this is exactly what, for example, SpaceX does. They send up satellites, they send up space rockets to the low Earth orbit or to the moon or to the Mars. So this is the first one, rockets and launch systems. Then you have space exploration companies, so actually the companies that design the spacecraft and they do some research or that are really at the forefront, that build vehicles that then go to Mars or to moon. This is kind of space exploration. And then you have, we've already talked a lot about the satellites. You have the satellite communication and satellite equipment and the data that you collect with these satellites, so the Earth observation and geospatial and satellite data. Because as you can imagine, there's a lot of data and a lot of power within these satellites. And then last but not least, there are also companies that produce the materials because, of course, satellites, rockets, they need to use very special materials. There are also companies that focus on producing just the materials or the smaller products for these space companies, but that don't then design or send the stuff up to space. Yeah, and we will have a look at, and there are actually a lot of companies already. They tend to be smaller, the space companies, but there are a lot of public companies and also private companies. Because I will talk about the public companies later on, I now want to talk about a little bit about the private companies. So you can see here the private companies, for example, SpaceX, already mentioned a couple of times. They, in the rockets and launch system segment, they have more than 80% of market share. So they are really, really the big players here, and they have pioneered the way of this reusability of the rockets. Then you have ULA, that's United Launch Alliance. It's actually a joint venture from Boeing and from Lockheed Martin. So both these big aerospace companies, they have founded a new company together. They earned 50-50, but that company isn't successful so far. It cannot compete with SpaceX, and it's rumored that it is actually being up for sale again. Yeah. Then I brought also a little German company, ESA Aerospace. They have now also launched their first rocket, and you see there's smaller companies, innovative companies that you have in this rocket and launch system, but they are private. Yeah. And in the space exploration, already mentioned Blue Origin, that sent, they design, also just like SpaceX, they design the spacecrafts and the rockets. Then there's Astroforge. Astroforge, that's a quite interesting concept because they do space mining. So what they do is they go to asteroids and they have identified, I don't know, there's platinum, for example. They explicitly look for platinum and palladium metals on asteroids, and then they want to mine them. And so far they've reached, or they got 55 million of funds from different investors. And what's also quite interesting, Orbit Fab, that's space refueling, so that's a petrol station in space. Also not really a big company, a smaller company, but also doing some innovative work, and their developments have been, currently are in approval. Starlink is in satellite communications. A very, very major player, but there are many other satellite communication companies that I will present shortly. So now you see all the investment, let's say, possibilities, the players, but I quickly want to go through the advantages and disadvantages of these investments with you shortly, how you can actually invest into these and what benefits there are and what disadvantages. So aerospace and defense, I already mentioned, because they are very, very diverse, there's rather limited upside and very low exposure to the actual space industry. Yeah? So as mentioned, they're not part of our strategy. Public conglomerates, the same, they have very limited exposure. Private space companies, of course, they shape the space industry. They're oftentimes leaders, but it is very difficult. You cannot invest. They are private space companies. It is very difficult for investors to directly allocate funds to these private companies. And then you have the public space companies. So there you have a lot of different high exposure companies that operate in these segments that I've explained, but they tend to be currently rather small, and of course, every single company brings their own risk. Right? If you put all your investments into one single stock, it also is quite risky. I will show you a few examples later on. Yeah? And that's why we're here in a passive investment conference. So that's why ETFs, of course, are an option and a very reasonable option in such a risky industry. And aerospace and defense ETFs, they, of course, then include the big ones, but they, again, are very diverse. And then you have pure play space-focused ETFs and funds. They give you then the combination to the different companies within this theme. They spread the risk, of course, here within across the theme, and they can capture the growth trends within the theme. That means that if you just buy a single investment, you maybe have to rebalance on some time to time. You have to continuously monitor whether that investment still is reasonable, and you could miss out on new developments like IPOs. There's always rumors when SpaceX or Starlink, when does it IPO? So this also is not possible with single investments, or you could miss it, but an ETF that uses specific rules that is managed, that can actually then capture these trends exactly. And this brings me to the Van Eck Space Innovators ETF. So this ETF was launched by my company, by Van Eck, in 2022. And it is actually currently the only space ETF in Europe. Since then, it has gathered 93 million of assets, and it has returned approximately almost 20% performance per year. For example, in 2024, that was even more, with 42%. So it was a very interesting field to monitor. And when you look at the top holdings, we have 25 companies, as mentioned. It's, for example, Rocket Lab. I will go later into it. That's a rocket manufacturer. Yeah, but also satellite companies in the top 5. It's a passive ETF, and there are, of course, several risk factors that you always have to know when you invest into a thematic ETF. If you just invest into the single industry, it can happen that this promises, these expectations that you think how also the full industry will develop could not materialize. So there's still this risk, and this is why we oftentimes recommend to have these thematic strategies rather as a satellite, in a core satellite strategy. So this also makes sense here, given that there are many satellites, to have satellites in a strategy. But of course, there are also emerging market companies and foreign currencies that add some risk to the strategy in comparison to maybe a very standard S&P 500. As mentioned, yeah, it's a passive ETF, so we follow an index. We follow this market vector global space industry ESG index. So it's rules-based, and the index provider has designed some rules that we follow. For example, it has relatively low market capitalization standards with 150 million USD. It also has a rule that the maximum weight per company should not exceed 8% to guarantee a specific level of diversification, and it's rebalanced quarterly so that you really can capture the growth themes. Yeah, it also includes an ESG screen to promote the environmental and social characteristics. It's thus labeled as Article 8 to not have highly controversial companies included in the strategy. What is very important, and I've touched it already a number of times, is this revenue. This revenue criteria that we have in our thematic ETFs. So we do only include companies that at some point in time had 50% of their revenues in the space industry, and as the space industry we define, or the index provider defines, these 4 different sub-themes. So it's space exploration, rockets and propulsion systems, so the rocket launch companies, satellite equipment, and also this other satellite equipment with including Earth observation and GPS data. And yeah, then as mentioned, it's a passive index, so we don't have any specific targeted allocation for these sub-themes. So for example, you see here satellite communication. Actually, currently we have several companies, 9 companies in the ETF that take up 44% of the weights. But this is not fixed, and this can continuously change. So this is currently how the market is. Satellites are very important in the space industry. AST Space Mobile, this is actually the company that is working together with Vodafone on improving the connections here in Europe. SAS and Eutelsat Communications, these 2 companies were rumored to replace Starlink and were trading actually in the Q1 at values beyond their fundamentals. But you also have, for example, Global Star, a company that already in 2022, it worked together with Apple to provide you emergency connections when you don't have a phone connection. No matter whether you have Vodafone, T-Mobile, or whatever your provider is. For example, when I go to my basement and I don't have any connection, I could still use the emergency phone numbers, because Apple has integrated into my iPhone the satellite function now that they work on together with Global Star, but only for emergencies. Yeah, and that's also, I think, quite beneficial, and just shows as one example of the benefits of this strategy here. Then, as a second area, we have the space exploration. 13%. There are actually 4 companies in the ETF. You see, this is actually a rover from the MDA Space company, but we also have other interesting companies, Intuitive Machines and iSpace. They both have been working on rovers and landers, for example. And Intuitive Machine, that's actually quite a good example for risky investments in space. They have just in a couple of months ago, in Q1, they have sent, and they were the first private company to do so, they have sent a rover to the moon. But when the rover landed, it flipped to the side and they lost the connection. So it actually, this whole mission, it ended early and it was unsuccessfully, and then also the stock price, of course, dropped. So this shows again how risky single investments can be, but also how, in general, the space industry can shift depending on successful missions that, of course, then improve a lot. but also on failures. This is something that investors always should bear in mind. And the same is, for example, for iSpace, a Japanese company that is working on this. Rockets and propulsion systems. So this is actually what you see here on the picture is a picture from Rocket Lab. We've received all the pictures that we used directly from the companies to show you in the video, but also in the presentation, some real-time images. And Rocket Lab is the largest company in the ETF, and it actually has performed substantially, given that it had a lot of successful contracts with government agencies in the last years, and has launched more than 200 satellites themselves, more than 1,700 satellites with Rocket Lab technology already in the orbit. And this is also quite a promising sector, this rocket and propulsion system, and that if at some point SpaceX would, for example, do an IPO, this is also where SpaceX would then be included in this area here. Then we have the aerospace and product manufacturers. So here we have, for example, Hexcel, Melrose, and Ducommun. Hexcel is producing several materials, very intensive materials, carbon materials that are used in spacecrafts. So you can imagine they have to have a very high density and very high quality. And Hexcel, for example, is producing materials for that. Satellite equipment, and this is actually the picture I was talking about earlier. You see here how large a satellite actually is. This is one from Eutelsat, from the European company. You see how small the people are. Most of you probably see the people down there. And of course, you need some equipment to communicate with that. So Western New Web, for example, has then some receivers, some modules that connect with these satellites on the ground. And last but not least, we have the Earth observation and GPS data. So, for example, Planet Labs, NextNav, Spire Global, and IQPS, they all have 8% in the ETF, relatively small. But of course, you can do a lot of environmental monitoring, Earth observations. You could Planet Labs, for example, this is a picture from them. They can scan from the Earth, from the space, the whole Earth, and can observe earthquakes and other points that happen in the environment. Exactly, and that's the QR code for our ETF. Feel free to scan it. You will be then linked to our website, and this is our contacts for the EMEA business development team, in case you're interested to reaching out. And thanks a lot for your attention, and have a good lunch break.